All right, welcome back, grade 9. So we're looking at chapter 2, the YCJA. And before we look at some stats, which is the main focus here today, to see to what extent we have youth crime in Alberta, I'm going to look at some information about the YCJA, just so that we can review, what is it, what is its main purposes and things like that. So the YCJA, does anybody remember what the letters stand for? Yes?
Youth Criminal Justice Act?
Yeah, so we're talking about youth, talking about crime, so Youth Criminal Justice Act, right? Youth Criminal Justice Act, we used to have the Young Offenders Act, but it was replaced by the YCJA in 2003. And let's see if we can see some more content here about what the YCJA actually is. So it applies to all young people living here in Alberta between the ages of 12 and 17. So when you become 18, you're an adult, you'll be tried as such. But if you're 11, as we explored yesterday at the end of class, then you're in a gray area in terms of legality here in Alberta. So depending upon the crime, there may not be a quid pro quo, a precedent set as to how to try you. And even with violent crime like murder, it is a very gray area there. So laws says you're an adult at 18, so at 18 the YCJA does not apply. Young people still must be accountable. So one of the principles of the YCJA is that young people need to be accountable. So accountability is one of the principles. So in your notes, if you're taking notes right now, and you're encouraged to do so, one of the things you could be writing down is YCJA and principles and accountability. Accountability is a big principle. So accountability means that there needs to be some response to your criminal actions. Accountability. So to be held accountable. We've talked about with crime and justice systems that there could talk about rehabilitation and retribution and deterrence. Accountability often fits into that retribution. How will you be held accountable so that there's consequences for your actions? There's consequences for your wrongdoings. These consequences must be proportionate to the seriousness of the crime. So there are countries in the world and civilizations, cultures, governments that have had some absurd punishments for crimes. So there was a time in Afghanistan where if you were flying a kite, you may be punishable by death. Now, some background on that is flying a kite was a sign that you were a drug dealer, and it was a sign so that people could come over and buy opium and other drugs like that from you. But still, imagine being a child flying a kite, being sentenced to death. So one of the key things in order to have justice, and that's the big overall theme of this chapter 2, how do we have justice? Well, we need to make sure the consequences are proportionate to the seriousness of the crime. Consequences must be proportionate. We don't want a government that is overreacting or underreacting. Must be proportionate, right? So accountability, consequences must be proportionate to the crime. There is specific details within the YCJA that says that they will prohibit adult sentences for adolescents ages 12 to 14. So this has become controversial, as we will see in this chapter, that there have been cases in Alberta where adolescents ages 12 to 14 have been, their wrongdoings have included being compromised by things like murder. So they've been connected to murder, whether they've been a murderer themselves or an accomplice to murder. We've had people in that gray area, 12 to 14, committing murder. And as we saw yesterday, we've even had people younger than 12. The YCJA allows adult sentences for those 14 and over if the crime is serious enough. So if you're 14 and you're accused of murder and you're found guilty of murder, then you may have a sentence fitting. But one thing the YCJA does is it allows most young offenders to avoid a criminal record. Why might that be important? Why might that, I got this big ocean in the middle of the classroom, I can stand it. Why might that be significant that the young offenders can avoid a criminal record? That's one of the goals of the YCJA, is that it allows most young offenders to avoid a criminal record. Why is that important? Well, we want the young offender to have a chance at rehabilitation, right? We want that young offender to have a chance of a somewhat fresh start. And if they are permanently branded as a wrongdoer, as a criminal, then their lives may be quite limited early on. So the idea of avoiding a criminal record, that will allow them to still have international travel. It will allow them to still have jobs like the one I have today. Teachers cannot have criminal records. So the Young Offenders Act and now the YCJA allows young offenders to have a chance to realize their wrongdoing, to rehabilitate, and to get a fresh start. So I think that's a key part here. Here are some of the principles and objectives of the YCJA. Obviously, it's part of the justice system, so we're trying to prevent crime. But it's not as simple as prevent crime through deterrence. So if we wanted to just simply prevent crime through deterrence, then we would have punishment that would stop you from acting. Deterrence is like, oh, I better not do that because I want to avoid the punishment. So if deterrence was the primary focus of the YCJA, then the punishment would be similar to the adult punishment, or it might even be worse, so that you're so afraid. It's like, well, if I get caught for breaking an entry, I'm going to go to jail for 15 years. If I get caught for grand theft auto, I'm going to go to jail for 25 years. If I get caught for, assault and battery, I'm going to go to jail for 12 years. I don't want these sentences. I can't afford it. I don't want to be in prison, right? I should be saying prison, not jail. So, being that we're not just dealing with the deterrence part, we're also dealing with let's deal with addressing the circumstances of why the crime took place. We want to rehabilitate the young criminal. So that's one of the objectives here. It's not just to punish. It's not just to deter. It's also to rehabilitate. Rehabilitate meaning to deal with the circumstances that led this person to doing that wrongdoing. Once we rehabilitate, the goal is to reintegrate young people into society. Because if somebody feels marginalized, even if they've been rehabilitated and then they get put back into society, but they don't fit, and no one wants to create a space for them, then they may end up reverting back to wrongdoing. So after the rehabilitation comes the necessary reintegration, and the government and other agencies can provide some assistance with that. Definitely, there must be consequences for their offense. We talked about that. But the YCJA also needs to recognize either the immaturity or the maturity of the offender. So this is that fair and equitable part. Fair and equitable, we need to determine the maturity level of the offender. At what emotional state, at what moral state was this individual at the age of 12 when they committed the crime? And ultimately, we're also trying to protect the public. So those are some of the principles and objectives of the YCJA. So what do they mean by consequences? What do we mean by consequences, right? There's going to be some consequences. Steps taken to help youth understand the implications of their actions. So when there needs to be meaningful consequences for the wrongdoing, one of the things that has to be addressed is a crime has been committed. So if I'm the young offender and you're the government working with me to try to address the crime, if I'm not willing to accept that I committed a crime, if I'm denying that I committed a crime, then rehabilitation is unlikely. Because I'm not accepting the fact that I did anything wrong. If I won't accept I did something wrong, then it's unlikely I'm going to change my action. Because I don't see anything wrong with what I did before. So one of the first steps is we need to address the crime. That was something wrong that you did. Canada is a nation of values, and as we address the crime, we're going to try to promote community and provincial and national values. And when we're promoting community values, there are special places within that, there's an opportunity within that stage for the community to come together and be part of the solution. So this is where in many Indigenous cultures, you'll have things like a sentencing circle, where there's many stakeholders that get together and they talk about the crime. This is why it was wrong what was done. This is what was wrong with it. And it's not that there's something wrong with you, something wrong with what you've done, but this is how together we can fix this. That's the idea of a sentencing circle, looking at it as more than an isolated incident, looking at it as an opportunity to communicate about core values, help fix the harm done to victims and the community. So one of the steps here with the YCJA is, you know what, there's been some harm done to an individual or individuals, but also to the community. So we talked about how there needs to be an equaling. This is how much harm you've done, now we need to do that much good. So this is where things like community service may become a part of the solution. Meaningful consequences need to respect gender and ethnic and cultural and language differences, and does involve the family, community, and other groups, as I've mentioned, including special consideration for things like sentencing circles with the Indigenous Aboriginal youth. Here are some more specific consequences. More specifically, you can see things like, statistically not the best approach, as offenders often learn prison habits, but one consequence might be that you're held in custody, right? That you're locked up, you're locked away, that you need to be separated from society for your safety and for the safety of others. That's not our goal. Our goal isn't to make you into a professional criminal. There's some extra judicial measures that can be taken. Things like apologizing and counseling, seeking restitution, trying to create on repairing broken relationships. This can include restorative justice. Restorative justice, maybe you vandalize somebody's fence, and the solution might be you need to fix the fence. Restorative justice. You're going to restore what you've damaged back to its original state. Restorative justice. That sounds like justice. That sounds fair. Rehabilitation may include the need to have counseling for things like addictions, like drug and alcohol and anger management. That it's hard to rehabilitate someone if they're not of sound mind because of drugs or alcohol or anger. So why are you angry? If we don't get to that, then we can't get to why did you commit the crime. We have to deal with the root cause. We need to trace the crime back and say, okay, what began? What began this path? What was that initial thing? And sometimes it may be an anger that you have, that you're dealing with others from a position of anger all the time. Reintegration into society may include attending school, but having curfews. May include that you have a restriction on who you can associate with. So even though in Canada we have the freedom of association, you may have certain associations you're not allowed to have. So if you're a young male or a young female and you've committed crimes against the opposite gender, crimes of quote unquote passion, but more like, you know, domineering stuff where there's physical violence, a part of that reintegration might be that you're not allowed to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. You're not allowed to have those personal relationships until your counselors, your psychiatrists are at a position where they can determine that you're safe to have those relationships. So there can be a criminal record in the sense, even a closed youth record can be reopened in childhood if more crimes are committed. So it's not like you get away scot-free. It's like, oh man, from the ages of 12 to 13, I stole 14 cars and woohoo, I got away with it because under 14, I can't be tried as an adult. And then, as an adult, they'll never see that. Well, if I go and commit grand theft auto at 25, the justice system can still look back. Say, you know what, this isn't your first time. This is the first time we've caught you in a while, but you do have a history of grand theft auto. So there are some critics that may suggest that the new Young Offenders Act, which is the YCJA, isn't harsh enough. And you may see cartoons like that. In fact, I'm really tempted. I think I'm gonna put that cartoon on Monday's evaluation. And I want you to talk about that cartoon. But with the cartoon, I'll have some questions. Like questions that will make you talk about rehabilitation and deterrence and some of those things like restorative justice. But I'm going to use that cartoon as the basis. So in the cartoon, we have a young criminal that just happens to be a really big person compared to the adult. Young criminal that has weapons, including a gun and a knife and some chains. And the government there is saying, you asked for it, now hold out the other wrist. So a colloquial term is being slapped on a wrist. That if you've done something wrong and you get a slap on the wrist, it means you really haven't been punished. Like if you commit murder tonight and the police catch you and there's a trial and you're found guilty of that, and then the judge is like, you know what, you're going to get a slap on the wrist. It's like, oh, here's my wrist. Ooh, that stings. That's inconvenient for like 15, 20 seconds. That's not really reasonable consequences. So people would look at this cartoon and say, the criticism here is that it's not reasonable. There's not enough consequences for young offenders. So that's just some background information about the YCJA that is included in our document that you've already looked at. But here we go. Now we're going to go to the website and look at some stats, because I'm a numbers person. I really like to see numbers. Maybe some of you are numbers people. Maybe you'll have a future in business or economics or accounting. Maybe you'll run your own business. There's lots of cool things like that. But you can use numbers to see to what extent has the YCJA been effective. So there's a series of charts and stuff here, and let's take a peek. Let's take a peek. So in your notes, you might have a new section just say, to what extent has the YCJA been effective? Unfortunately, the stats are from 2014, so it's the first decade of the YCJA. Yes, it's 2020 now, so there's been 6 years since then. We're looking at that window, right? The first decade of YCJA, and to what extent was it effective? So even in that first bulleted point, I'm going to move it up. Even in that first bulleted point, there's evidence that makes me think that the YCJA still has room to be more effective. How do we know, based on that first bulleted point, that youth crime is still an issue in Canada? So the first bulleted point's the one up here, up at the top. So looking at the bulleted point up at the top, if you wanted to prove to me that youth crime is still an issue in Alberta, then what's the stat that you'd say, oh, there it is. That's how we know it's an issue. This is where we need like the Jeopardy music or something to be playing. So the first bulleted point says this. There were almost 101,000 youth aged 12 to 17 accused of criminal code violations, excluding traffic, so we're not talking about a speeding ticket, reported by police in 2014, resulting in a youth crime rate of 4,322 people, youth, per 100,000 youth population. While youth make up 7% of the Canadian population, they comprise 13% of persons accused of crime. So what does that first bullet show us? That youth are committing twice as much crime as adults per capita. That's a problem. So demographically, if you're trying to get rid of crime, then you say, oh, well, who's committing crime? Well, disproportionately, it's the youth. They're committing twice as much crime as adults. So that last cartoon where the young offender was getting a slap on the wrist, somebody that suggests that the YCJA is too lenient would look at that and say, here's my proof. It's too lenient. Youth in Canada are still twice as likely to be criminals as adults. Why are they criminals? Well, the YCJA hasn't dealt with it then, have they? So, then the next bullet says, for the most part, police reported youth crime involves relatively minor offenses, so maybe that's uplifting, right? Well, just minor things. So what's a minor offense? The most frequent criminal offenses committed by youth in 2014 was theft of 5,000 or under, mischief, and common assault. The rate of cannabis possession, which, cannabis has been legalized, but unless I'm wrong, it's not legal for minors. The rate of cannabis possession was also high, as were the combined rates of young or youth accused of offenses related to the administration justice together with violations under the YCJA. So let's go back to it and say, okay, if the number one thing is theft under $5,000, then why are students stealing stuff? Why are people 12 to 17 stealing stuff? So the YCJA needs to look at the root cause of crime. Why do people feel it necessary to steal? Are they stealing out of necessity? Do we have Canadian children, 12 to 17, Alberta children, 12 to 17, living in poverty that they have to steal to survive? Or are they doing it for a thrill? If they're doing it for a thrill, then that's different than they're doing it to eat. And that's why the YCJA, to be fair and equitable, they have to look at, why did you do that? The police reported youth crime rate has been falling steadily since 2006, continuing a longer term downward since 1991. So that's a good thing, right? So that would be evidence that, oh, maybe this YCJA thing is working. The rate of youth accused of crime in 2014 was lower than the rate of young adults aged 18 to 24, but over twice the accused rate for adults 25 and over. So in 2014, youth actually weren't the worst group, it was the new adults that were the worst group. So there is some suggestion that this generation may be a little less violent and criminal than the last generation. And there's other bulleted points, we're not going to talk to each one, but the link is in our digital textbook. So 1 in 10 incidents where a youth was accused occurred at school during school hours or supervised activity. So 19% of violent crime, 27% of drug offenses where a youth was accused were more likely to occur at school than property crimes. Interesting to know, being that we're in a school. So, we're going to go down and we're going to look at some charts and some stuff now. Otherwise, we could get lost in this report for a long time. So here's our first chart. Rates of youth accused of crime, 1977 to 2014. So this chart is so long, it covers such a long period, it even shows the time when I was a youth. That's how old this chart is. So you go back to 1977 and you can see that from 77 up to 91, youth crime was becoming quite significantly a problem. But since 91, like we've suggested, there is a downward trend. So based upon this, there's some sign that, you know what, maybe the YCJA has been a step in the right direction. That although we still have youth crime, it's not trending upward, it's trending downward. The youth are less likely to commit crime than they would have been 15 years ago, and less likely than 30 years ago. So the youth of today are less likely to be criminals than their parents were at their age. An interesting thing to think about. So now we can look at different crime. So total youth crime versus total crime. So total youth crime is in blue, total crime is in there. So you can see that the two things are trending together, but total youth crime, the lighter blue one, has dropped recently more than total crime. So again, this might be a suggestion that there's a bigger issue than just youth crime in Canada, it's crime in general. And looking at the fact that there's this correction with youth that we haven't seen with the adult population as much, maybe the adult population needs to be the focus. Here you got youth property crime in green. So that's really dropped in popularity. And youth violent crime is also down. Moving to this one, it gets even more specific. Youth are in the top, lighter blue, ages 12 to 17. Young adults are the darker blue, 18 to 24, and older adults are 25 and up. And in this one, you can see that violent crime, once you get over 25, we tend to commit a lot less violent crime. But it's not necessarily just 12 to 17-year-olds. 18 to 24-year-olds are more violent. So, is this a trend in the right direction? Or is this just an observation that it takes us until 25 for our brains to mature to a point where violence doesn't become a knee-jerk reaction to situations? Property crime. Property crime drops pretty quickly once you own property, go figure. Other criminal code offenses. You can see how the young adults just explodes here. Obviously, traffic violations, when you have ages 12 to 17, most of them shouldn't be driving, so this shouldn't be a surprise. Drug offenses. So those are some interesting ones to report. The age of the accused. Now, we do have some seniors that are doing some wrongdoing, but it's pretty unlikely. That you can see where the mountain is, and it's young offenders, but it's also new adults. So if we have a special criminal code for young offenders, why don't we have something for our main pocket of criminals? It could be argued that maybe we need to address this next. Different types of offenses again. So uttering threats is in this kind of orangey color. You got break and entry in purple, and most of them are trending down. Assault on all levels, though, age of the accused, you can see that assault kind of sticks around all the way to 25. So whereas, the theft under drops dramatically once people have $5,000 of their own, so they don't need to steal it from someone else. And things like cannabis possession dropped, but that assault kind of sticks around for our young adults. Some sexual crime, sexual violence, sexual assault, and the age of the accused. Again, you can see a peak here and here. So this looks at the location of crime. One way to deal with crime is to say, where's crime happening? Where's the crime happening at? And depending upon the age and the type of crime, it may be happening at home in light blue, may be happening at school, might be happening at school during supervised hours or unsupervised. So at school seems to be where a lot of the drug crime is happening. So that's probably where they're maybe getting an opportunity to purchase it or to use it without parents or guardians watching. Some other selected offenses, just for interest's sake. And again, cannabis possession has been changed in the sense that it has been decriminalized and legalized. Time of day when violent criminal incidents happen. So even that can be traced. You know, when's the most dangerous time? Not at 1 o'clock in the morning, which is interesting. You know, it's definitely not at 6 o'clock in the morning. That's when maybe the young offenders would be sleeping. But it's, mid-afternoon. Mid-afternoon. So what can we do with youth and with non-youth so that there's a more productive thing for them to be up to in the mid-afternoon? Maybe this is where we need organized sports, community leagues, things like that, so that they have other options to fill their time than crime. Percentage of accused in incidences involving multiple accused. So lots of stats, right? And there's lots of stats because the government has a vested interest in ending crime, because crime is expensive. It's costing the communities hundreds of millions of dollars in property damage, in lost wages, in the cost of the justice system. But there's also a cost to the victimization of individuals and the loss of productivity of those who end up becoming locked away. So now we can look at how many guilty sentences there are. There's less guilty people. So YCJA comes into effect, boom, and suddenly we're seeing less people found guilty. We're finding other ways to deal with the crime under the YCJA. So, this website contains a number of visuals, charts and graphs, and other ways to represent data that allows us to determine to what extent has the YCJA been effective. Looking at that, if you were going to argue, if you were going to write a paragraph and your topic sentence was, the YCJA has been effective, what's your evidence? From what we just looked at, what's the most convincing points that you would say, you know what, this is what I'd want to bring up? If my argument was the YCJA is effective, then what's your evidence? Yes?
Crimes are dropping.
Crimes are dropping. So if your topic sentence, if your argument is the YCJA is effective, then your next sentence is evidence to support that argument, and you might get into the idea that, you know what, look, crimes are dropping. That's evidence, right? Anything else that would further your argument, that would defend your argument that YCJA has been effective? Anything else you'd see? Yes?
Crime rates are dropping a lot lower than the adult ones.
Yeah, so we see that crime rates are dropping, but when we take a closer look, we can see that crime rates among youth are dropping at a faster rate than among adults. So we have to ask ourselves the question, well, what's different between the adults and the youth? And one of the most obvious answers is the YCJA. So perhaps the YCJA has been effective. If you wanted to write a different paragraph, if your paragraph was going to lead with the topic sentence, the YCJA has been ineffective, right? If that was your topic sentence instead. The YCJA has been ineffective, right? It's been ineffective. It has not worked. YCJA has been ineffective, what's your next sentence? What's your evidence? Yes? Yeah, so we still have crime. You can say we still have crime. And look at the crimes. Look at the types of crimes. Look at the wrongdoing that's still happening. So in summary, chapter 2 is about justice. Chapter 2 is about youth justice and young offenders. And in chapter 2, we spend most of it looking at the YCJA. We need to know the purpose of it. We need to know, why do we have it? What are its core principles? And we need to be able to evaluate and say, has it been effective? And that's what this lecture has just accomplished. So I would recommend that if you don't have a whole bunch of notes in front of you, the great thing about these lectures is they're in our digital textbook, they're on our YouTube channel. You can go back and rewatch this and get some more notes down if you need to. That's the summary of the YCJA, and that's the summary of to what extent has it been effective. So I'm going to end the lecture, and then we're going to move on to another application of justice. We're going to look at an actual crime case study and let you be the judge.